What if I told you that foolishness is not just a lack of intelligence, but something far more insidious, capable of turning brilliant minds into destructive instruments? What if the greatest threat to civilization is not the villains committing atrocities, but ordinary people who have simply stopped thinking? Imagine a renowned scientist with numerous academic degrees suddenly begins to believe and spread dangerous misinformation. A compassionate teacher starts to endorse harmful ideologies. A loving parent makes a decision that jeopardizes their own children. These are not villains, but smart, kind people who have fallen victim to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the power of foolishness. And what makes this truly frightening is that it happens not to someone else, but to people just like you and me. This is not merely philosophical musings. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted his infamous obedience experiments at Yale University. Ordinary volunteers, obeying authority, were supposedly instructed to deliver increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. Despite the screams of pain, 65% of the participants continued to administer shocks that they believed could be lethal. These were not sadists or mentally ill individuals, but ordinary people who temporarily relinquished their ability to make independent moral judgments. This is what Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany, leading him to one of the most disturbing theories about human nature. But before we delve into it, I want to ask you, have you ever believed something simply because everyone around you believed it too? Keep that question in mind as we explore perhaps one of the most significant psychological insights of modern times. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not a typical philosopher pondering abstract ideas in a tower of ivory. He was a German Lutheran pastor witnessing his society change right before his eyes. Born in 1906 into an intellectual family, his father was a renowned psychiatrist and neurologist. Bonhoeffer had every reason to believe in the power of education and rational discourse. But when the Nazi Party came to power, he witnessed what shattered his faith in human rationality. He saw his fellow citizens, educated, cultured, and religious people, begin to support policies and leaders that contradicted everything they seemed to believe. These were not ignorant masses, but individuals manipulated by clever propaganda. They were professors, doctors, clergy, and intellectuals actively participating in their own intellectual subjugation. In his prison cell in 1943, awaiting execution for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote his darkest observation: "Against foolishness, we are defenseless. Protests and the use of force will not help here. Rational arguments do not reach their target." What made this observation so chilling was not only its context, but also its accuracy. Evil, as he noted, always carries within it the seed of its own destruction. It creates anxiety and resistance. Ultimately, it leads to collapse. But foolishness is convinced that it is doing good, which makes it completely impervious to correction. Perhaps the most insightful observation by Bonhoeffer concerned how foolishness supports existing power structures. Most people realize that they are acting wrongly, which causes internal conflict and ultimately leads to disintegration. However, individuals immersed in functional foolishness are convinced that they are doing good, which makes them absolutely resistant to correction. This is not by chance. Those in power no longer need to actively suppress information. It is enough for them to create conditions under which honest processing of information becomes excessively complicated. When Bonhoeffer used the word foolishness, he did not mean low intelligence or lack of education. He described something much more complex, what we might call functional foolishness or willful ignorance. In his letters from prison, he explained that a foolish person is often stubborn, but this should not obscure the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, it feels as though you are dealing not with a personality, but with slogans and cliches that have been imposed upon him. This is what makes Bonhoeffer's theory so revolutionary. He argued that foolishness often arises not from individual shortcomings, but from systemic pressures that make independent thinking both difficult and costly. In fact, our economic systems actively encourage intellectual simplification. Social networks earn billions when users react emotionally rather than think critically. News agencies receive more clicks through outrage and sensationalism. Politicians win elections with simple slogans rather than complex political proposals. When people work multiple jobs, drown in debt, and are constantly subjected to information overload, individual capitulation becomes a survival strategy. What economists call rational ignorance becomes more efficient for individuals than studying complex issues that require time and effort. But this individual rationality creates collective irrationality, precisely the dynamic that Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany. The result is not merely an individual choice, but structural pressure leading to intellectual capitulation, and our brains, exhausted and overloaded, are perfectly adapted to submit. While economic systems push us toward intellectual simplification, our brains are actually programmed to comply. Leon Festinger's research in the 1950s on cognitive dissonance showed how this works psychologically. When people encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, their brains struggle to reject it. But this is what Bonhoeffer understood, and what modern psychology has confirmed. This process intensifies when people are in a state of stress, overload, or economic instability. Such conditions are created in our modern systems. Bonhoeffer noted that foolishness often manifests in group situations and wrote about it. It becomes clear that foolishness is not a psychological issue, but a sociological one. He observed that quite rational individuals abandon their critical abilities when they become part of a larger group or movement. This insight was decades ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's experiments on conformity in the 1950s clearly demonstrated what Bonhoeffer had observed. When people are surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of them agree with the group at least once, even if they understand that the group is mistaken. Now imagine how this plays out in our digital age. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that simplify this transformation like never before. A study by MIT in 2018 showed that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social platforms. But here's the key point. This happens because false information often seems more emotionally satisfying than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that confirms their worldview, they participate in a system that rewards intellectual simplification over careful analysis. The algorithm feeds them similar content, creating echo chambers that act like intellectual swamps. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed shows exactly what you want to see? This is not a coincidence. It is the architecture of conscious ignorance in action. We see this pattern repeated throughout history. The trials of the Salem witches were conducted by malicious individuals, but also by God-fearing members of the community who sincerely believed they were protecting their neighbors. The Red Scare of the 1950s was not initiated by evil actors, but by patriotic Americans who genuinely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, smart, educated people abandoned critical thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional certainty. If our brains and systems are set against us, how can we fight back? Bonhoeffer believed that liberation from foolishness requires what he called costly grace, the willingness to think independently, even when it is painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But now we understand that we are not only battling social pressure, we are fighting against millions of years of evolution and billions of algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts. On an individual level, we can cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and may be erroneous. This means actively seeking information that contradicts our beliefs, not to torment ourselves, but to test whether our convictions are worth holding on to. Here are some specific practices that can become your daily measures of resistance against intellectual capitulation. First, practice intellectual friction. Set aside time each week to read reasoned opinions from people with whom you disagree. This does not necessarily have to change your mind, but it will allow you to test how resilient your beliefs are to criticism. Also, embrace productive ignorance. When you are absolutely certain about something, ask yourself a question. What evidence could change my mind? If nothing comes to mind, that is a warning sign. Next, notice the process of information sharing. Before posting anything online, take 60 seconds to verify the data from an independent source. This short pause can interrupt the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our emotional reactions. And finally, learn to say, "I do not know," when you truly do not know something. In a world where confident ignorance is valued more than humble uncertainty, acknowledging gaps in your knowledge becomes a real challenge. But personal practices alone are not enough. Necessary structural changes are required to make intellectual honesty more accessible and meaningful. This means that social platforms must disclose their algorithmic biases and content selection methods. It also implies funding extensive campaigns to enhance media literacy, teaching people to evaluate sources and evidence. Furthermore, it is essential to develop online platforms that reward intellectual humility rather than tribal confidence. Most importantly, economic policies are needed to reduce stress and uncertainty that make people vulnerable to manipulative tricks. When individuals are not constantly worried about health, housing, and employment, they have more mental energy for thoughtful reflection on complex issues. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theory was brilliant for its time, but here is what he could not know. It is not just about moral capitulation or social pressure. Modern neuroscience reveals something much more alarming. Our brains are literally wired for functional stupidity. Think about it. Bonhoeffer witnessed Nazi propaganda spreading through newspapers and radio, while we live in an era where this has become far more dangerous. We have transitioned from Nazi propaganda to social media algorithms that know exactly which psychological buttons to press. And now we are entering an era of deep fakes capable of fabricating reality itself. The threat is not just increasing, it is targeting the very structure of human thought. It is not only about Nazis or propaganda, it concerns the wiring of your brain. Our minds have evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources more than unfamiliar ones, and to seek information that confirms existing beliefs. These traits helped our ancestors make quick decisions when hesitation meant death. The most frightening thing is that we are all vulnerable, regardless of how intelligent we consider ourselves to be. The mechanism is exactly what Bonhoeffer spoke about. When people feel threatened and insecure, they become more susceptible to authoritative explanations that simplify complex issues into straightforward narratives. But here is the key understanding that makes Bonhoeffer's warning more relevant than ever. We are no longer just facing manipulation from individuals, but we are also dealing with systems developed by artificial intelligence that exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is meticulously analyzed and turned against our ability to think independently. We witnessed this in real time during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with proven analytical skills, began to spread debunked theories about vaccines and treatment methods. These were not failures of intelligence. They were failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented pressure. Bonhoeffer paid the highest price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence. He was executed by hanging on the 9th of April, 1945, just weeks before the surrender of Germany. His last words, as testified by one of the prisoners, were, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice was not only a political resistance, but also a defense of the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking for themselves, they cease to be fully human. They become, in his words, puppets, manipulated by the force that at this moment is the most powerful. But what makes Bonhoeffer's final challenge so relevant today? Who tires? When the pressure to conform becomes unbearable, when independent thinking requires courage, when the price of truth is higher than the cost of comfortable lies. Who tires? The answer does not lie in superior intelligence or education, but in the daily choice to remain curious rather than insecure, to seek truth rather than comfort, to think carefully rather than react quickly. These are not heroic acts. They are ordinary practices that become extraordinary when everyone around stops engaging in them. The tragedy is that intellectual capitulation often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It is uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in one's mind at the same time. It is painful to admit that you might be wrong about something important. But Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of remaining human. In a world that profits from our intellectual capitulation, the choice to think independently becomes a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth. We are all susceptible to functional stupidity. The moment we think it does not apply to us, we are already beginning to give in. The price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when it becomes difficult. Bonhoeffer's theory of foolishness is troubling precisely because it is so accurate. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believe in obviously false things, educated individuals make catastrophically poor decisions, and well-meaning citizens support policies that contradict their own values. The problem is not that people are becoming less intelligent, but that our systems increasingly encourage intellectual shortcuts instead of thoughtful analysis. However, within this troubling diagnosis lies real hope. If foolishness is partially a choice, it can be rejected. If it is conditioned by structures, those structures can be changed. If it is the result of information overload, we can create conditions that facilitate thinking rather than complicate it. Imagine critical thinking as physical exercise. At first, it is uncomfortable, but necessary for strengthening. Just as we do not expect to run a marathon without preparation, we cannot hope to navigate complex information without practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles needed for independent thinking require regular training. Otherwise, they will atrophy. The next time you are absolutely certain about something, when you catch yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without reflection, when you feel comfort in possessing all the answers, remember Bonhoeffer's warnings. Foolishness does not announce itself with fanfare. It whispers that you already know everything you need to. And at that moment, you can make a choice. Will you surrender for the comfort of certainty, or will you choose the more difficult path of intellectual independence? The question Bonhoeffer leaves us with is not whether we are smart enough to avoid foolishness, but whether we are committed enough to continue thinking when it becomes uncomfortable, inconvenient, or costly. In a world that profits from our intellectual submission, the choice to think carefully and independently becomes one of the most important things we can do. Here is my challenge to you. This week, find one belief that you hold firmly and spend 30 minutes exploring the best arguments against it. not to torment yourself or to sink into doubt, but to practice the intellectual courage for which Bonhoeffer gave his life. If your belief withstands the test, you will hold on to it with greater confidence. If not, you will learn something valuable about the difference between belief and truth. The future of human dignity may depend on how we collectively respond to Bonhoeffer's challenge. If this message has made you question what you once considered unquestionable, that is not a weakness. It is the beginning of intellectual courage. Share this message with someone who is not afraid to think deeply, even when it is uncomfortable. Because in a world designed to profit from our intellectual submission, the simple act of thoughtful thinking becomes the most important form of resistance. And this is what I want you to remember. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotions, thoughtful reflection over quick reactions, you are protecting not only your mind, you are defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age of artificial foolishness. What belief are you willing to question this week? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us be those who maintain resilience when everyone around stops reflecting.